There's, of course, the international perception, as we've mentioned in the studio. As the war goes on, there's backlash against Israel, and nowhere is that more apparent than the next generation of Americans. American universities seem to be raising a generation of radicals. Well, that's now a fight going to Congress. A House hearing last night grilled the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. In recent weeks, U.S. universities have become hotbeds of, in some cases, genocidal rhetoric, with leftist and pro-Hamas students gathering in the thousands, chanting "Gaz the Jews," chanting "Globalize the Intifada," chanting there is only one solution. That's a direct reference to Hitler's final solution. This is often accompanied by physical attacks on Jewish students. These protests, as well as Jewish students' reports of harassment at the school, were the center of the hearing held by the Committee on Education and the Workforce. The universities receive billions of dollars in federal funding, and the current atmosphere of anti-Semitism on campuses represents a clear violation of U.S. anti-discrimination law.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's code of conduct when it comes to bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be harassment.
The answer is yes. And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
What's the context?
Targeted as an individual, targeted at an individual.
It's targeted at Jewish students, Jewish individuals. Do you understand your testimony is dehumanizing them? Do you understand that dehumanization is part of anti-Semitism? I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
Back to you, Mark. I know that the two of us in this studio have discussed ad nauseum the rise of the radical progressive fringe with its insane racial worldview, but now we're seeing that become the dominant worldview, it seems, on these campuses. Congress stepping in, do they have power here?
They have limited power. They have the power of the purse. They have the power of getting the federal government to invoke its regulatory powers to do something about it. Of course, it's very difficult when you get the issue of speech and free speech and where's the line. Clearly, they've passed the line many times. The big question and the big issue, I think, to all of us is, look, campuses always had a large group of anti-Israel sentiment. I mean, I saw the difference when I was in Columbia College. I graduated in the 70s, and I went back into graduate school in the 80s, and it had changed dramatically in that period of time. The reason I don't have a PhD right now is because of an incident with anti-Israel people on campus, which is a whole other story. Long story. But at any rate, the reality is that there's been a jump that we don't really fully understand, and we can explain it, but it's gone from anti-Israel sentiment to anti-Semitism straight out. It's also gone, the anti-Israel statement has grown tremendously, because if previously the anti-Israel people on campuses were talking about, 67 borders, Palestinian rights, they were never chanting "to the river, to the sea." I never saw in Columbia, both as an undergraduate or as a graduate, protests to eliminate Israel. The protests were Israel isn't doing the right things in occupying territories, all those sort of questions. But never did I see that in all the years that I was in Columbia, and that was in the 70s and 80s. So there's been that jump both in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of anti-Israel, to eliminate us, and plus the fact that it's jumped to absolute anti-Semitism. Now, we can explain part of it with the leftist view that suddenly the white Jews are part of the establishment, and therefore they're the enemy. It's so interesting because the right-wing anti-Semites, they were not part of the white, we're make-believe whites. So we have this situation where we're not good here, we're not good there. But it's an amazing transformation. It's very, very frightening. If everyone I speak to who's on campus or have kids on campus is really scared. They don't know what to do at this point. And this doesn't seem like a safe place to come to, but it's probably the only solution these days.
These protests, these movements on campus seem to be a direct manifestation of some of the polls that we've already discussed, showing that something in the vicinity of 52% of young Americans under the age of 25 actually support Hamas in this war rather than Israel, despite a large portion of them saying that October 7th was genocide and that it was justified anyway. How did this radical fringe become the dominant school of thought among the progressive movement?
Two things. One, social media and TikTok particularly. All surveys show that 70% of the views on TikTok are anti-Israel, and only 30% are pro-Israel. And that's a major thing. We don't know whether it's the algorithm or it's just because there are more Muslims in the world. I don't know the answer to that, but it's clearly the fact. As a matter of fact, if you look at the different social medias, TikTok has 10 times the amount of people who have become more anti-Israel and being on it than, let's say, Facebook does. It's an amazing difference. So that's a big thing. And of course, the under 25 use TikTok more than anything else. The rest of us use other social media. So that's number one. Number two, it's the radical professors on the campuses that have been teaching this revolutionary theory that has gotten a lot of attention and taught a lot of kids in ways that we can't believe. Look, we had the radical generation of the 60s and 70s became professors, and their views are quite to the left and quite extreme in many cases. And the universities have given them tenure, and they're in positions that they can't be moved, let's put it that way. So you have these factors come together with a lack of knowledge. People don't have a knowledge of history. They're not really interested in real history. We know how little history is actually taught and how many is actually learned. So they barely know American history. Do you expect them to understand Middle Eastern history? No, but it sounds good. Hey, come on, revolutionary. And we're with the left. We're with them. And so the young people like being on that side.
It's a fashion.
Yep, very much so a fashion, very much what they want to be part of. And that's part of the problem, too. We have a really lot of work ahead of us that I'm not sure we're even up to taking this on at this point.
Nonetheless, we've seen these institutions, college campuses, for about a decade now, become the official crackdown on their definition of hate speech, going to the ends of the earth to make sure that people can't share what's considered offensive views. This has even spilled over into the private sector with just about every social media company since the 2017, 2018 or so, pushing speech codes, anti-hate speech, even the U.S. government pushing them to do the same thing. Why are the Jews excluded from that? Why is hate speech against the Jews perfectly fine?
Well, I think I've read recently a statement by Abba Eban. We're always excluded. We're excluded from living in Moscow. We're excluded from having land. We're excluded to being, all the different things. The Jews have always been excluded. So anti-Semitism as well. We're excluded. We're not the group that you have to worry about. We're strong white people. Why do they have to care about us? It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing that it's 2 generations after the Holocaust, and everything's been forgotten without a question.